The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Margaret Cathedral, casting rainbow shadows across empty pews that should have been filled with San Antonio's most prominent families. Wedding flowers wilted in their arrangements, their sweet fragrance now carrying an undertone of something bitter, something wrong. The altar stood decorated but abandoned, a monument to promises that would never be spoken. It was June 18th, 1983, and what should have been the wedding of the decade had become the mystery that would haunt a city for generations. Vivian Hartwell was supposed to walk down that aisle at exactly 3:00 that Saturday afternoon. The 24-year-old daughter of oil magnate Charles Hartwell and socialite Eleanor Hartwell had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Or so everyone believed. Instead, her ivory silk gown hung motionless in the bridal suite of the Plaza Hotel, never to be worn, while 300 guests waited in confusion for a bride who would never appear. To understand what happened that June morning, we must first understand who Vivian Hartwell was and the world she inhabited. San Antonio in the early 80s was a city caught between its historic charm and modern ambitions. The Hartwell family represented old money, the kind that flowed from Texas oil and real estate ventures that stretched back 3 generations. They lived in a sprawling estate in Alamo Heights, where manicured gardens and wrought iron gates separated them from the ordinary world beyond. Vivian had grown up in this bubble of privilege, attending private schools, summer camps in Colorado, and debutante balls that made the society pages. Those who knew her described a young woman caught between expectations and her own desires. She was beautiful in that effortless way that money can polish but not create, with auburn hair that caught light like copper, and green eyes that seemed to hold secrets even in childhood photographs. Her engagement to Richard Pemberton had been announced the previous Christmas at the annual Hartwell Holiday Gala. Richard, 29, was everything the Hartwell family could want in a son-in-law. His father owned the largest construction company in South Texas, and Richard himself had already proven his business acumen by expanding their operations into commercial real estate. He was handsome in a conventional way, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to question your place in the world. But those closest to Vivian noticed changes in her behavior during the months leading up to the wedding. Margaret Sinclair, her oldest friend since childhood, would later tell investigators that Vivian had become increasingly withdrawn. Their weekly lunches became less frequent, and when they did meet, Vivian seemed distracted, often staring out windows as if looking for something that never appeared. The wedding preparations themselves had become a source of tension within the Hartwell household. Eleanor Hartwell had taken charge of every detail with the precision of a military operation. The guest list alone had required 3 revisions to accommodate business associates, political connections, and social obligations spanning 2 generations. The Plaza Hotel had been booked for 18 months, and Eleanor had personally overseen everything from the imported orchids to the 12-piece orchestra. But Vivian seemed increasingly disconnected from these elaborate plans. Hotel staff later reported that during dress fittings, she would stand silent and still while her mother discussed alterations and accessories. When asked direct questions about her preferences, Vivian would simply nod and agree to whatever was suggested. This passive acceptance struck those who knew her as unusual, given her typically strong opinions about everything from art to politics. Charles Hartwell, while less involved in the wedding details, had his own concerns about his daughter's upcoming marriage. Business associates noted that he seemed unusually tense during the weeks before the ceremony. Some speculated that the substantial dowry he was providing, rumored to include both cash and shares in Hartwell Industries, was straining even his considerable resources. Others suggested that combining the Hartwell and Pemberton business interests was more complicated than either family had anticipated. The warning signs, visible only in hindsight, were scattered throughout that spring. Vivian had been taking long drives alone, something she had never done before. Her housekeeper, Rosa Martinez, mentioned finding tear-stained tissues in Vivian's bedroom wastebasket on multiple occasions. Most telling, perhaps, was the conversation Margaret Sinclair remembered from early May. They had been walking through Brackenridge Park when Vivian suddenly stopped beside the river and asked a question that would haunt Margaret for decades. "Do you think it's possible to love someone and still feel like you're drowning?" When Margaret asked what she meant, Vivian simply shook her head and changed the subject to the unseasonably warm weather. Richard Pemberton, for his part, seemed oblivious to any problems. He was busy with his own wedding preparations, which included a bachelor party in Las Vegas and meetings with his accountant about the financial advantages of the marriage. Friends described him as excited and confident, making plans for the honeymoon trip to Europe and discussing the house they would build in the exclusive King's Crown development. The last person to see Vivian was her younger brother Thomas, who was home from college for the wedding. He found her in their father's study at around 11:30 on Friday evening, sitting in the leather chair behind the massive oak desk. She was holding a photograph, though he couldn't see what it depicted from where he stood in the doorway. "Getting nervous about tomorrow?" he asked, trying to lighten what felt like a heavy mood in the room. Vivian looked up at him with an expression he would later describe as profound sadness, mixed with something else, something that might have been relief. "I was just thinking about choices," she told him, "about how sometimes the path that looks right from a distance becomes impossible once you're actually walking on it." Thomas, 21 and focused on his upcoming senior year at the University of Texas, didn't press her for details. He wished her good night and went to his own room, assuming his sister was simply experiencing normal pre-wedding anxiety. That was the last confirmed conversation anyone had with Vivian Hartwell. The morning of June 18th began with the kind of controlled chaos typical of major society weddings. Eleanor Hartwell was at the hotel by 7, supervising the flower arrangements and coordinating with the catering staff. The bridal party was scheduled to arrive at 10 for hair and makeup, followed by a light lunch and the formal photographs before the ceremony. Margaret Sinclair arrived at the hotel promptly at 10, carrying the small beaded purse that would complement her maid-of-honor dress. She expected to find Vivian already there, probably nervous but excited, surrounded by the other bridesmaids and family members. Instead, she found Eleanor Hartwell on the phone, her usually composed demeanor showing cracks of concern. "She's running late," Eleanor explained, hanging up the phone. "Charles went to the house to get her. You know how she is about timing." But Margaret could hear the uncertainty in Eleanor's voice, a note that suggested this delay was different from typical tardiness. By 11:30, when Charles Hartwell returned to the hotel alone, the nature of the problem became clear. Vivian was not in her bedroom. Her bed had been slept in, but she was nowhere to be found in the house or on the grounds. Her car, a white Mercedes convertible that had been her graduation present, was missing from the garage. The first assumption was that Vivian had gone for a drive to calm her nerves, a theory that seemed plausible given her recent habit of taking solo trips around the city. Charles and Richard drove the routes she typically favored, checking the park, the Riverwalk, even the small coffee shop near Trinity University where she sometimes went to read. By 1 o'clock, with guests beginning to arrive at the cathedral, the family was forced to confront the possibility that something more serious had occurred. Charles Hartwell made the difficult decision to contact the police, though he asked them to be discreet given the high-profile nature of the situation and the hundreds of people who would soon be gathering for the ceremony. Detective Luis Rodriguez was the first officer to respond to the call. A 10-year veteran of the San Antonio Police Department, he had handled missing person cases before, but never one involving such prominent families or such unusual circumstances. His initial assessment was that they were likely dealing with a case of cold feet rather than anything sinister, but he began the investigation with the thoroughness that would characterize his work on the case for years to come. The search of Vivian's bedroom revealed few clues, but several puzzling details. Her suitcases, packed for the European honeymoon, remained untouched. Her jewelry, including several valuable pieces she had planned to wear during the trip, was still in its boxes. Most of her clothes appeared to be accounted for, though Rosa Martinez thought some casual items might be missing. More intriguing was what they found on Vivian's dressing table. A letter, written in her distinctive handwriting, sat unsealed beside her jewelry box. The letter was addressed to Richard, but its contents raised more questions than they answered. In it, Vivian apologized for what she called her inability to continue with our plans, and asked him to understand that some promises become impossible to keep, no matter how much we might wish otherwise. The letter provided no explanation for her disappearance, no indication of where she might have gone, and no suggestion of whether she was in danger. It was signed simply V, rather than with her full name or any term of endearment. Detective Rodriguez noted that the handwriting appeared steady and deliberate, suggesting it had been written calmly rather than under duress. Meanwhile, at the cathedral, Eleanor Hartwell faced the impossible task of informing 300 guests that there would be no wedding. The official explanation, delivered with as much dignity as she could manage, was that Vivian had suffered a family emergency and the ceremony would be postponed indefinitely. Most guests accepted this explanation graciously, but the society reporters present sensed a larger story developing. By evening, as the sun set over San Antonio and the wedding reception that should have been celebrating became a gathering of confused and concerned family members, the search for Vivian Hartwell had expanded citywide. Her white Mercedes was found in the parking lot of Brackenridge Park, unlocked and with no signs of struggle. Her purse was on the passenger seat, containing her driver's license, credit cards, and nearly $300 in cash. The discovery of the car only deepened the mystery. Brackenridge Park held special significance for Vivian, as it was where she had spent countless hours as a child and where she had shared that troubling conversation with Margaret just weeks earlier. But security guards who patrolled the area overnight reported seeing nothing unusual, and no witnesses came forward who remembered seeing Vivian or anyone else near the vehicle. As the investigation entered its second day, Detective Rodriguez began conducting formal interviews with family members and friends. What emerged was a portrait of a young woman who had been struggling with pressures and expectations that no one had fully recognized or understood. The perfect life that the Hartwell family had constructed around Vivian, built on wealth, social status, and carefully planned futures, had begun to crack in the months before her disappearance. But understanding Vivian's state of mind was only the beginning of unraveling what had happened to her. As Detective Rodriguez would soon discover, the Hartwell family harbored secrets that went far deeper than a reluctant bride's cold feet, and the investigation would reveal conflicts and contradictions that would challenge everything San Antonio society thought it knew about one of its most prominent families. The case of the vanishing bride was just beginning, and the answers, when they finally emerged, would prove far more complex and troubling than anyone could have imagined. The investigation that followed Vivian Hartwell's disappearance would consume the San Antonio Police Department for months, creating ripples that extended far beyond the missing person case itself. Detective Luis Rodriguez found himself at the center of a media storm that transformed a local mystery into a national obsession, with reporters from Dallas, Houston, and even New York descending on the city to cover what newspapers dubbed the case of the vanishing bride. In those first crucial weeks, every lead seemed to dissolve upon closer examination. The initial theory that Vivian had simply gotten cold feet and fled to start a new life elsewhere seemed logical enough, but the evidence didn't support it. Her bank accounts remained untouched, her credit cards showed no activity, and despite extensive searches of bus stations, airports, and hotels throughout Texas, no trace of her could be found. Charles Hartwell hired his own team of private investigators, led by a former FBI agent named Marcus Webb. Webb brought resources and connections that the local police couldn't match, including contacts in law enforcement agencies across the Southwest. But even with this expanded search capability, the weeks passed without any meaningful progress. It was as if Vivian had simply ceased to exist the moment she walked out of her family home that Friday night. The strain on the Hartwell family became evident to anyone who knew them. Eleanor Hartwell, once the undisputed queen of San Antonio society, withdrew from public life almost entirely. Friends who called were told she was unavailable, and the charitable events she had once organized with military precision were quietly cancelled or handed over to other families. Charles continued to go to his office, but business associates noticed his distraction and increasingly short temper during meetings. Thomas Hartwell, who had been looking forward to his senior year at the University of Texas, found it impossible to concentrate on his studies. The weight of being the last person to speak with his sister pressed on him constantly, and he replayed their final conversation obsessively, searching for clues he might have missed. He eventually took a leave of absence from school and returned home, spending his days helping with the search efforts and his nights lying awake, wondering if there was something he could have said or done differently. Richard Pemberton's reaction to his fiancée's disappearance was more complex and, to some observers, troubling. In the immediate aftermath, he appeared appropriately concerned and cooperative with investigators. He provided detailed accounts of his recent interactions with Vivian, turned over all correspondence between them, and even submitted to a polygraph test that he passed without difficulty. But as the weeks turned to months, his behavior began to shift in ways that raised questions among those who knew him. Rather than maintaining a low profile or showing the kind of ongoing distress one might expect from someone whose bride had vanished, Richard began to return to his normal social activities with what struck many as unseemly haste. He was seen at business dinners, golf tournaments, and even a few parties, always offering the same explanation when questioned, that he had to continue living his life while hoping for Vivian's safe return. Some viewed this as a healthy coping mechanism, while others wondered if it revealed something darker about his true feelings toward his missing fiancée. Detective Rodriguez found himself increasingly frustrated by the contradictions and dead ends that seemed to define every aspect of the case. The more he learned about Vivian and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance, the more complex the picture became. Friends and family members provided conflicting accounts of her state of mind, her relationship with Richard, and her plans for the future. Some described her as excited about the wedding despite normal pre-ceremony nerves, while others painted a picture of a young woman trapped by expectations she felt powerless to escape. One of the most puzzling aspects of the investigation involved Vivian's activities during the weeks before her disappearance. Credit card records showed several purchases that seemed out of character, including camping equipment from an outdoor supply store and several large cash withdrawals from her personal account. When questioned about these transactions, Eleanor Hartwell insisted she knew nothing about them, while Charles suggested they might have been related to surprise honeymoon plans that Vivian had been keeping secret. The camping equipment was never found, despite extensive searches of the Hartwell property and the areas around San Antonio, where Vivian was known to spend time. This discovery led to speculation that she might have planned her disappearance in advance. But it also raised the disturbing possibility that someone else had been involved in whatever had happened to her. Margaret Sinclair, devastated by the loss of her oldest friend, became an unofficial spokesperson for the family's ongoing search efforts. She organized volunteer search parties, distributed flyers with Vivian's photograph throughout the region, and maintained contact with law enforcement agencies across multiple states. Her dedication was both admirable and heartbreaking, as she refused to accept that her friend might be gone forever. During one of their conversations, Margaret shared with Detective Rodriguez a detail that would haunt him for years to come. She remembered that during their last meaningful conversation, the one by the river in Brackenridge Park, Vivian had asked her about a hypothetical situation. What would Margaret do, Vivian had wondered, if she discovered that her entire life had been built on a lie and that the only way to find the truth would be to leave everything behind? At the time, Margaret had assumed her friend was speaking philosophically, perhaps influenced by a book she was reading or a movie she had seen. Now, the question took on a much more ominous significance. The media attention surrounding the case created its own set of problems for the investigation. Reporters camped outside the Hartwell estate, followed family members to church and business meetings, and offered substantial rewards for any information about Vivian's whereabouts. This publicity generated hundreds of tips from across the country, each of which had to be investigated and verified. The vast majority proved to be false sightings or attempts to claim reward money, but Rodriguez and his team couldn't afford to ignore any of them. One tip that seemed promising came from a truck driver who claimed to have seen a young woman matching Vivian's description at a rest stop near Austin on the morning after her disappearance. The woman had been alone, he said, and seemed distressed or frightened. She had asked him for directions to the nearest bus station, but when he looked back a few minutes later, she was gone. Despite extensive investigation, including interviews with bus station personnel and reviews of security footage, this lead, like so many others, ultimately led nowhere. As 1983 turned to 1984, the active investigation began to wind down. New cases demanded Detective Rodriguez's attention, and the leads in Vivian's disappearance had dwindled to nothing. The official case remained open, but the daily searches and constant follow-up calls became weekly, then monthly, then quarterly check-ins. The Hartwell family continued their private search efforts, but even their resources were not unlimited, and the private investigators they had hired eventually moved on to other cases. The impact on San Antonio society was profound and lasting. The Hartwell family had been fixtures in the social hierarchy for generations, their presence taken for granted at charity galas, political fundraisers, and cultural events. Vivian's disappearance created a void that went beyond the loss of one person. It represented the fragility of the ordered world that the city's elite had constructed around themselves. If someone like Vivian Hartwell could simply vanish without explanation, what did that say about the security and stability they all assumed was their birthright? In the years that followed, the case became part of San Antonio folklore. New residents would hear the story from longtime locals, usually with additional details that grew more dramatic with each retelling. Some versions portrayed Vivian as a tragic figure, trapped by family expectations, while others suggested she had been the victim of foul play. A few romanticized accounts described her as a free spirit who had found the courage to escape a life that wasn't truly her own. The wedding dress, still hanging in its protective covering at the Plaza Hotel for weeks after the cancelled ceremony, eventually became a symbol of the mystery itself. Eleanor Hartwell couldn't bring herself to retrieve it, and the hotel management, out of respect for the family, stored it in their lost and found for months before finally returning it unopened to the Hartwell estate. Years later, when the family eventually moved to a smaller house in Olmos Park, the dress was donated anonymously to a local charity, where it was sold to a bride who never learned its tragic history. Richard Pemberton's life moved forward in ways that surprised many who had known him during his engagement to Vivian. Within 2 years of her disappearance, he was dating regularly again, and by 1986, he had married a young woman from Houston whose family was involved in the banking industry. The new Mrs. Pemberton was blonde, where Vivian had been auburn-haired, outgoing where Vivian had been reserved, and seemed to embrace the social responsibilities that Vivian had found so burdensome. The marriage appeared to be successful, producing 3 children and lasting until Richard's unexpected death from a heart attack in 2001. Charles Hartwell never fully recovered from his daughter's disappearance. Business associates noticed that his once sharp focus on deals and strategy seemed diminished, and he began to delegate more responsibility to his partners and subordinates. The oil industry experienced significant changes during the 1980s, and Hartwell Industries, which had once been aggressively expansionist, became more conservative in its investments and operations. Some attributed this shift to changing market conditions, but those closest to Charles knew that his heart was no longer fully engaged in the business that had once defined his identity. Eleanor Hartwell's transformation was even more dramatic. The woman who had once orchestrated elaborate social events with the precision of a master conductor became a near recluse. She maintained minimal contact with the friends who had once been central to her life, and when she did venture out in public, she seemed diminished somehow, as if the loss of her daughter had drained something essential from her spirit. She developed what appeared to be an obsessive interest in missing person cases around the country, subscribing to newsletters and joining support groups for families of the disappeared. Thomas Hartwell eventually returned to the University of Texas and completed his degree, but his career path differed significantly from what the family had originally envisioned. Instead of joining the family business or pursuing law, as his parents had hoped, he became a social worker, specializing in runaway and missing youth cases. His colleagues knew about his sister's disappearance, but Thomas rarely spoke about the connection between his professional calling and his personal tragedy. Those who worked closely with him noted his exceptional ability to connect with families facing the loss of a child, and his success rate in resolving difficult cases was remarkable. Detective Rodriguez continued working missing person cases throughout his career, but Vivian Hartwell's disappearance remained the one that haunted him most deeply. He kept the case file on his desk for years, reviewing it periodically and following up on any new leads that emerged. Even after his retirement in 1998, he maintained contact with the Hartwell family and continued to research similar cases, hoping that patterns or connections might emerge that could finally provide answers. The 1990s brought new technologies and investigative techniques that offered fresh hope for solving cold cases. DNA analysis, computer databases, and improved communication between law enforcement agencies across state lines made it possible to revisit old mysteries with tools that hadn't existed during the original investigations. Rodriguez, working as a private consultant in his retirement, convinced the San Antonio Police Department to reopen several cold cases, including Vivian's. The renewed investigation yielded some interesting discoveries, but no breakthrough answers. Advanced analysis of the note Vivian had left for Richard revealed that it had been written with a pen that contained ink from a batch manufactured only during a specific 6-month period, which helped confirm the timeline but provided no new insights into her state of mind or intentions. A review of financial records using more sophisticated computer analysis revealed the pattern of cash withdrawals and unusual purchases more clearly, but still couldn't explain what had motivated these transactions. Perhaps most significantly, the new investigation uncovered evidence that the original search of Brackenridge Park, where Vivian's car had been found, had been less thorough than originally believed. Time constraints and the focus on more populated areas had led investigators to overlook some of the more remote sections of the park, particularly areas near the river that were difficult to access and rarely visited by the public. By 2010, San Antonio had grown and changed dramatically from the city Vivian Hartwell had known. The old money families that had once dominated its social structure were now part of a much more diverse and complex community. New industries had emerged, the population had doubled, and many of the landmarks familiar to Vivian's generation had been demolished or repurposed. Brackenridge Park remained, but even it had been modified and expanded, with new trails, facilities, and recreational areas that bore little resemblance to the quieter, more secluded place where Vivian had once walked with her friend Margaret. Margaret Sinclair, now Margaret Chen, after her marriage to a pediatrician she met in the early 1990s, had never stopped thinking about her missing friend. She had maintained contact with the Hartwell family over the years, attending Charles's funeral in 2003 and checking on Eleanor regularly until the older woman's death in 2007. Thomas Hartwell, the only surviving member of his immediate family, had become something of a surrogate son to Margaret, and they met regularly to share memories and discuss any new developments in the case. It was Margaret who first suggested that advances in ground-penetrating radar and other archaeological techniques might make it worthwhile to conduct a more thorough search of Brackenridge Park. She had read about similar technologies being used to solve historical mysteries and cold cases, and she wondered if these tools might reveal evidence that had been missed during the original investigation. Thomas was initially reluctant to pursue this avenue, partly because he had come to accept that they might never learn the truth about what happened to his sister, and partly because he feared that definitive bad news might be harder to bear than continued uncertainty. But Margaret's persistence, combined with Rodriguez's enthusiasm for the proposal, eventually convinced him to support a new search effort. The decision to conduct an expanded search of Brackenridge Park required approval from multiple city departments, as well as cooperation from the current police administration. The case had become legendary within the department, passed down through generations of detectives as an example of how even the most thorough investigation could fail to solve a mystery. The current chief, Maria Santos, had been a rookie patrol officer when Vivian disappeared, and she remembered the intense media coverage and the pressure the department had faced to solve the case quickly. Chief Santos agreed to support the new search effort, but with conditions. The investigation would be conducted discreetly to avoid renewed media attention that might interfere with the work. The search would be limited in scope and duration to avoid excessive costs to the city, and the Hartwell family, through Thomas, would contribute to the expenses associated with the specialized equipment and personnel required. The search began on a cool morning in November 2010, 27 years after Vivian's disappearance. A team of archaeologists from the University of Texas, working with ground-penetrating radar specialists and cadaver dogs, began a systematic examination of the areas of Brackenridge Park that had received the least attention during the original investigation. The work was painstaking and often tedious, with hours of careful scanning producing nothing more significant than buried trash or natural geological features. Margaret and Thomas took turns visiting the search site, sometimes bringing flowers to leave at the spot where Vivian's car had been found decades earlier. Rodriguez, now in his 70s but still sharp and engaged, served as an unofficial consultant to the effort, sharing his memories of the original investigation and providing context for the new discoveries, however minor they might be. On the third day of the search, the dogs became agitated in an area near the river that was partially hidden by a stand of old oak trees. The ground-penetrating radar revealed an anomaly approximately 4 feet below the surface, in a location that would have been completely invisible to searchers working without specialized equipment. The anomaly appeared to be roughly rectangular and about the size that might contain personal belongings or other evidence related to the case. The excavation that followed was conducted with the care and precision of an archaeological dig, with each layer of soil carefully removed and examined before the team proceeded deeper. At a depth of 3.5 feet, they encountered a metal box, corroded by decades of exposure to groundwater, but still intact enough to preserve whatever contents remained inside. The box, when finally opened in the controlled environment of the police forensics laboratory, contained items that immediately confirmed its connection to Vivian Hartwell's disappearance. Inside were pieces of jewelry that Eleanor Hartwell had reported missing from her daughter's room, including a distinctive pearl necklace that had belonged to Vivian's grandmother. There were also several photographs that appeared to have been taken from the Hartwell family albums, showing Vivian at various ages from childhood through her early 20s. Most significantly, the box contained a second letter written in Vivian's handwriting, much longer and more detailed than the brief note she had left for Richard. This letter, addressed to anyone who finds this, provided the first real insight into Vivian's state of mind during her final days and the circumstances that had led to her disappearance. Reading it felt like hearing a voice from beyond the grave, speaking across nearly 3 decades to finally tell a story that had remained hidden for so long. The contents of that letter would change everything investigators thought they knew about the case, revealing secrets that had been buried as deeply as the box itself, and pointing toward a resolution that no one had anticipated during all those years of searching and wondering. After 27 years of silence, Vivian Hartwell was finally ready to tell her story, and the truth was more complex and surprising than anyone had imagined. The letter that emerged from that corroded metal box would forever change how everyone understood the final days of Vivian Hartwell's life. Written in her careful script on hotel stationery from the plaza, it bore a date from 2 weeks before her scheduled wedding, suggesting she had been planning her disappearance far longer than anyone had realized. "To anyone who finds this," the letter began, "I hope that by the time these words are read, enough time will have passed for the truth to bring healing rather than more pain. I know that my disappearance will cause suffering to people I love, and that knowledge weighs on me more heavily than any other burden I carry. But I have come to understand that sometimes the greatest act of love is to step away from a situation that can only lead to greater harm for everyone involved." The letter went on to reveal secrets that the Hartwell family had guarded for generations. Vivian wrote about discovering documents in her father's study that suggested Charles Hartwell had been involved in business practices that went far beyond the ethical boundaries she had believed defined her family. Money that she had assumed came from legitimate oil investments had apparently been generated through dealings with individuals and organizations that her research suggested were connected to criminal enterprises. I found correspondence that made it clear my wedding was not just a celebration of love, but a business transaction designed to legitimize money that should never have been in our family's possession, Vivian wrote. Richard's family construction company had been used to launder funds for years, and my marriage would have made me complicit in activities that I could never accept. The dowry that was being discussed so carefully was actually a way to transfer questionable assets from one generation to the next, using the respectability of marriage to mask what was essentially a criminal conspiracy. The revelation explained so much about the behavior that had puzzled investigators for decades. Charles Hartwell's increasing tension in the weeks before the wedding, Eleanor's obsessive control over every detail of the ceremony, and Richard's surprisingly quick recovery after Vivian's disappearance all took on new meaning in light of these discoveries. But the letter contained an even more shocking revelation. Vivian had not disappeared alone. "I have found someone who understands the weight of carrying family secrets and the courage required to walk away from a life that looks perfect from the outside, but is built on foundations that cannot support the weight of truth," she wrote. "David Martinez has helped me see that there are alternatives to the future that seemed inevitable, and together we have planned a new beginning that will allow both of us to live with integrity rather than compromise." David Martinez was Rosa Martinez's son, a detail that sent shockwaves through everyone who had known the family. Rosa had worked for the Hartwells for 15 years, arriving each morning to clean and organize the mansion in Alamo Heights, but she had rarely mentioned her personal life to her employers. David, it emerged, had been working as a paralegal for a law firm downtown while finishing his degree in criminal justice at night. His access to legal resources had helped Vivian research the documents she had found, and his understanding of the law had confirmed her worst fears about her family's business activities. The relationship between Vivian and David had developed slowly over the months leading up to the wedding, beginning with casual conversations when he would occasionally help his mother with larger cleaning projects at the house. These interactions had evolved into deeper discussions about justice, responsibility, and the courage required to make difficult moral choices. What had started as friendship had eventually grown into love. But more importantly, it had become a partnership built on shared values rather than social expectations. David has shown me what it means to love someone for who they are rather than what they represent, Vivian wrote. With him, I am not the Hartwell heiress or Richard's fiancée or my parents' carefully groomed daughter. I am simply myself, with all my doubts and fears and hopes for a better future. Together, we have found the strength to choose a difficult truth over a comfortable lie. The letter explained the camping equipment purchases and the cash withdrawals that had puzzled investigators. Vivian and David had been planning to disappear together, to start fresh in a place where their past associations could not follow them. They had researched new identities, saved money from Vivian's personal account, and carefully prepared for a life that would be materially much harder than what they were leaving behind, but ethically cleaner than what they could no longer accept. I know this choice will be seen as betrayal by people who love me, and I accept that burden, Vivian continued. But I have come to believe that sometimes betrayal of expectations is necessary to remain faithful to principles. I cannot marry Richard knowing what I know about his family's business. I cannot continue to benefit from money that was obtained through methods that cause harm to others. And I cannot live the rest of my life pretending that wealth and social status matter more than honesty and justice. The final portion of the letter was addressed specifically to her family members, with personal messages that revealed the depth of her love for them despite the choices she was making. To Thomas, she wrote about hoping he would understand that courage sometimes looks like running away rather than standing and fighting. To her mother, she expressed gratitude for all the sacrifices Eleanor had made, while also explaining why she could not accept the future that had been so carefully planned for her. To her father, she offered both forgiveness and a challenge to find his own way back to the ethical foundations that had once guided his decisions. To Richard, I can only say that I hope someday he will see this not as rejection, but as an attempt to save both of us from a marriage that would have been built on deception. He deserves someone who can love him without conditions or reservations, and I deserve the chance to build a life based on truth rather than convenience. The letter was dated 3 days before the wedding, but it had clearly been written as part of a longer planning process. The final paragraph revealed that by the time anyone read these words, Vivian and David would already be established in their new lives under different names, in a place where they could contribute positively to their community without carrying the weight of their family's complicated histories. I leave this box as both explanation and apology, the letter concluded. I hope that someday the truth it contains will help heal the wounds my disappearance has caused, and that the people who love me will understand that my choice was made from love rather than selfishness. I pray that David and I will have found the kind of life together that makes these sacrifices worthwhile, and that our children, if we are blessed to have them, will grow up in a world where choosing principle over profit is not seen as naive, but as necessary. The discovery of the letter and its revelations created a media sensation that dwarfed even the original coverage of Vivian's disappearance. The story of the oil heiress who had walked away from wealth and privilege to expose her family's criminal connections captured public imagination in ways that few true crime cases ever achieve. But for those who had known and loved Vivian, the media attention was secondary to the emotional impact of finally understanding what had happened and why. Thomas Hartwell, now in his late 40s and the sole survivor of his immediate family, found himself grappling with revelations that recontextualized his entire childhood and young adult life. The wealth that had provided his education, The social status that had opened doors, the business empire he had chosen not to join. All of it took on different meanings in light of Vivian's discoveries. His decision to become a social worker rather than joining Hartwell Industries suddenly seemed less like rebellion and more like intuitive wisdom. "Part of me always knew," Thomas told Margaret during one of their long conversations in the weeks following the discovery. "Not the specifics, but the feeling that something wasn't quite right about our family's business. Vivian was always more perceptive than I was, more willing to ask difficult questions. I think she saw things that I chose not to see because it was easier to remain ignorant." Margaret found herself experiencing a complex mixture of grief and relief. The friend she had mourned for nearly 3 decades had not been the victim of violence or tragedy, but rather the architect of her own liberation. The Vivian revealed in the letter was recognizably the same person Margaret had known since childhood, someone who had always been more concerned with fairness and justice than with social expectations or material advantages. "I keep thinking about that conversation we had by the river," Margaret said, "when she asked about loving someone and still feeling like you're drowning. She wasn't talking about Richard at all. She was talking about her family, about being trapped by circumstances that felt impossible to escape. I wish she had felt like she could tell me the truth, but I understand why she couldn't. The secret was too big, and the stakes were too high." Detective Rodriguez, now in his 70s, viewed the resolution of the case as both vindication and tragedy. His instincts had been correct that Vivian's disappearance was voluntary rather than criminal, but the full truth revealed a story more complex than any of the theories he had developed during the original investigation. "In all my years of police work, I never encountered a missing person case quite like this one," Rodriguez reflected. "Usually, when people disappear by choice, it's to escape personal problems or responsibilities. But Vivian disappeared to escape becoming complicit in activities that violated her moral code. In some ways, her choice took more courage than staying would have required." The revelations in the letter prompted a new investigation into the business practices of both Hartwell Industries and the Pemberton Construction Company. Federal agencies became involved, using sophisticated financial analysis techniques that had not existed during the 1980s to trace the flow of money and identify the criminal connections that Vivian had discovered. The investigation ultimately led to several indictments of individuals who had used both companies to launder money from drug trafficking and other illegal enterprises. Richard Pemberton, who had died in 2001, was found to have been aware of his family's involvement in money laundering, but was never charged due to his death and the statute of limitations on most of the activities in question. His widow and children were not implicated in any wrongdoing, having apparently been kept ignorant of the illegal aspects of the family business, just as Vivian had been for most of her life. The federal investigation also revealed that Charles Hartwell had been attempting to extricate his family from the criminal connections during the months before Vivian's wedding, but that the process was complicated by years of financial entanglement and the need to avoid prosecution for his past involvement. His increasing stress during that period reflected not just concern about wedding expenses, but fear about the consequences of trying to break free from relationships that had made his family wealthy, but had also compromised their integrity. In a tragic irony, one federal investigator noted, if Vivian had waited just a few more months, her father might have succeeded in cleaning up the family business and removing the ethical conflicts that drove her to disappear. But she had no way of knowing about his efforts, and he apparently felt he couldn't confide in her about the situation. The investigation also shed new light on Rosa Martinez's abrupt departure from the Hartwell household just days after Vivian's disappearance. Rather than being coincidental, her resignation had apparently been planned in coordination with her son David's role in helping Vivian escape. Rosa had been aware of her son's relationship with Vivian and had supported their decision to start fresh, even though it meant giving up her own stable employment with the family she had served faithfully for many years. Attempts to locate Vivian and David using the new information from the letter proved unsuccessful. The trail had gone cold decades earlier, and if they had succeeded in establishing new identities, they had done so with a thoroughness that defeated even modern investigative techniques. However, the federal investigators did discover evidence suggesting that someone matching their descriptions had been involved in community organizing and social justice work in several different cities during the 1990s, always staying just long enough to make a positive impact before moving on to avoid detection. It appears that they found a way to live according to their principles, one investigator concluded. If our theories are correct, they spent decades working to help people in marginalized communities, using the skills and resources they brought from their previous lives to make a real difference in the world. In some ways, Vivian Hartwell accomplished more by disappearing than she ever could have as a wealthy socialite in San Antonio. The emotional impact of these revelations extended far beyond the immediate family and friends who had been directly affected by Vivian's disappearance. The case became a symbol of the courage required to make difficult moral choices, and Vivian's story inspired countless individuals who were struggling with their own conflicts between personal advantage and ethical responsibility. A scholarship fund established in Vivian's memory provided financial assistance to students from working-class families who were studying criminal justice, social work, and other fields related to public service. The fund was administered jointly by Margaret and Thomas, who had decided to donate the proceeds from the sale of the remaining Hartwell assets to support young people who shared Vivian's commitment to justice and integrity. Vivian always believed that privilege came with responsibility, Thomas explained at the Scholarship Fund's first award ceremony. She couldn't find a way to fulfill that responsibility within the constraints of the life she had been born into. But maybe we can help other young people find ways to serve their communities without having to make the same impossible choices. The impact on San Antonio society was profound and lasting. The revelation that two of the city's most prominent families had been involved in money laundering operations forced a broader reckoning with the sources of wealth and power that had shaped the community for generations. Charitable organizations, cultural institutions, and political campaigns that had benefited from Hartwell and Pemberton money had to grapple with questions about whether accepting such donations had made them complicit in criminal activities. The Catholic Church faced particular scrutiny, as both families had been major contributors to various parish and diocesan projects over the years. After extensive internal review, church leadership decided to establish new protocols for evaluating large donations and to redirect some of the funds that had come from questionable sources toward programs serving victims of the types of crimes that had generated the original wealth. We cannot change the past, but we can choose how to move forward, Archbishop Martinez stated in a letter to parishioners. The revelation of these activities reminds us that we must always be vigilant about the sources of the resources we use to do God's work in the world. The story also prompted changes in law enforcement practices and business regulations designed to prevent similar situations from developing in the future. The Texas state legislature passed new requirements for financial reporting by construction companies and other businesses that handle large cash transactions, while banking regulators implemented stricter protocols for identifying suspicious money transfers. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the individuals who had been touched by Vivian's story and inspired by her choice to prioritize principles over comfort. Letters poured in from across the country from people who shared their own stories of difficult moral choices and the courage they had found to do the right thing, even when it meant personal sacrifice. A particularly moving letter came from a woman in Oregon who had discovered that her husband's successful restaurant chain was being used to launder money for a criminal organization. Inspired by Vivian's example, she had found the courage to cooperate with federal investigators, even though it meant losing her marriage and financial security. Reading about Vivian Hartwell helped me understand that some things matter more than being comfortable, she wrote. I may have lost everything I thought I wanted, but I found something more valuable, the ability to look at myself in the mirror without shame. As the years passed and the immediate media attention faded, Vivian's story became part of the folklore of moral courage that communities tell themselves to remember what is possible when people choose to act according to their deepest values rather than their immediate interests. Her name appeared on historical markers, in academic studies of whistleblower cases, and in the annual reports of organizations dedicated to fighting corruption and supporting ethical business practices. Margaret, now in her 60s, established a tradition of visiting Brackenridge Park every year on the anniversary of Vivian's disappearance. She would bring flowers to the spot where the metal box had been buried and spend time reflecting on the friend who had found the courage to choose love and justice over wealth and status. The park had changed dramatically over the decades, but the oak trees remained, and Margaret found comfort in the continuity they represented. I think about the life Vivian might have lived if she had stayed, Margaret mused during one of these annual visits. She would have been a good mother, a generous philanthropist, a leader in the community, but she also would have been complicit in activities that violated everything she believed in. The choice she made was incredibly difficult, but it was authentically hers in a way that the alternative never could have been. Thomas, meanwhile, had found his own way to honor his sister's memory through his continued work with missing persons cases. His unique perspective as someone who had experienced both the anguish of losing a family member and the complex relief of learning that the disappearance had been voluntary rather than violent made him particularly effective at helping other families navigate similar situations. Every case teaches me something new about the complexity of human motivations, Thomas reflected. People disappear for reasons that often make perfect sense to them, but seem incomprehensible to everyone else. Vivian's choice taught me to look beyond the obvious explanations and try to understand the deeper conflicts that might drive someone to make such a dramatic decision. The wedding dress that had hung unused in the Plaza Hotel for so many weeks found its own form of redemption. The charity that had received it anonymously eventually learned its history and decided to display it in their museum, alongside the story of Vivian's moral courage. Visitors from around the world came to see the dress and learn about the young woman who had chosen to walk away from a fairy tale wedding because she had discovered it was built on a foundation of lies. This dress represents both loss and liberation, the museum's curator explained to visitors. It reminds us that sometimes the most beautiful ceremonies can mask the most difficult moral compromises, and that true love requires the courage to seek truth, even when truth is inconvenient. The investigation's resolution brought a kind of peace to San Antonio that had been missing for nearly 3 decades. The mystery that had haunted the city's collective consciousness was finally solved, not with the tragedy that many had feared, but with a story of moral courage that challenged everyone to examine their own ethical boundaries and the prices they were willing to pay for security and respectability. In the end, Vivian Hartwell's disappearance became less important than her reappearance in the form of principles and values that continued to influence people long after she herself had vanished from public view. Her choice to prioritize integrity over advantage created ripples that extended far beyond her own life, inspiring others to make similarly difficult but necessary decisions when faced with conflicts between personal benefit and moral responsibility. The case files were finally closed, but the questions Vivian had raised about wealth, power, and ethical responsibility remained as relevant as ever. Her story became a reminder that sometimes the most radical act is not dramatic rebellion, but quiet insistence on living according to one's deepest values, even when that insistence requires leaving behind everything that once seemed important. And somewhere, perhaps, in a small community where two people had found ways to serve others while building a life based on love and justice rather than money and status, the courage that had once motivated a young woman to walk away from her wedding day continued to create positive change in the world. The mystery of Vivian Hartwell's disappearance was solved, but the legacy of her choice to disappear would endure for generations, proving that sometimes the most powerful way to change the world is to refuse to participate in systems that compromise the very values that make change necessary.